story, the 2 million Jews were massacred, I read one horrible, probably the most horrible morning of my life in Washington in November of 1942, and buried in the 8th or 10th page of the Washington Post. I remember it was on the left side of the page, on a little story, maybe the headline of about 3-4 inches. Wide saying, Rabbi Wise says 2 million Jews slain, or something to that effect. And this newspaper story changed my life, because I instinctively reacted. I said, this is the overwhelming thing happening in the world today that's dominating my life. In fact, I couldn't go on with what I was doing. I was the director of the Committee for a Jewish Army, which was, after all, very close to these issues. And I couldn't go on and keep an appointment that day with a congressman to talk about Committee for a Jewish Army, because it seemed futile. Therefore, without justifying and condoning Roosevelt, I must start by saying that in all decency, human decency, one has to ask, what did the Jewish leaders do to shake Roosevelt? Produced 2 concurrent resolutions in the House and in the Senate, which called on the president to establish a special commission to save the remnants of the Jewish people. And on this, the Jewish leadership, and especially the Zionist leadership, put monkey wrenches, because they said that you shouldn't say save the Jewish people, you should say save the Jewish people by opening the gates of Palestine. And we said that you're dooming them, because you shouldn't say save people conditionally to what? And
who were these leaders?
Wise testified. He got Congressman Bloom to have open hearings to stymie this resolution. And he came there and he testified. Naturally, he didn't say that it's bad to have such an agency. He said it's not enough. Well, if you say it's not enough, then it isn't good. Why should American congressmen do it if Rabbi Wise didn't? By the way, he didn't convince them. He managed to convince Bloom to pigeonhole it. It never came up for a vote in the House. But it passed unanimously in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. You know, even though once the House started hearings, the Senate was supposed to wait for it, except that, and we couldn't get the chairman, Tom Connolly, to take it up. And then one day we waited until one day he was sick. He was an old man. And the acting chairman was Senator Thomas Afuto, who was an intellectual Mormon religious man. And as a religious man, he planned it all. He's the man who told me, wait until one day I'll preside and have it passed unanimously. And he did. He said there's no opposition to this resolution. To the contrary, we all feel it should be done. And it passed.
And this led to the War Refugee Board?
This led to the creation of the War Refugee Board, which was a victory and a defeat. It was a victory because the president has heeded the pressure from Congress and from public opinion, because we raised a lot of hell, as you know. I mean, we did whatever humanly possible.
So, could the Jews have been saved?
Well, I mean, did Jews? Obviously not, because by the time we found out, there were already probably more than 1 million, maybe as many as 2 million or more Jews killed. So the Jews couldn't have been saved. But certainly not from the time that I learned about it, which is November 42. But could many, maybe even most of the surviving Jews of Europe, of the Jews who were alive in Europe in November 42, been saved? In my opinion, definitely yes.
How?
It's a heartbreaking statement to make, but and it haunts me, but this is my conviction. And I wish I didn't have it, but I've re-examined it, and unfortunately it holds. How very simply, you see, if let's take fantasy and let's take reality. Fantasy is if the same kind of reaction that my colleagues from Palestine and the American friends who worked with us in the Committee for Jewish Army, if they had the same reaction that we had, if Rabbi Wise, when he had that press conference the day before, about which I read in the paper, would have fainted right there, or would have torn his clothes, and would have called a meeting the next day of all the leadership of the Jews, and said, what are we going to do, and declared a real emergency. You know, I have no doubt they would have convinced the American government that it has to become a task of America's war aim. One of America's war aims would be to counter this German war aim of killing the Jews and becomes Americans' purpose to save the Jews. I don't think this was a difficult notion to put across. And but he didn't do that. He just said some very innocuous words and reacted normally, and then everybody went on to business as usual. And when I left Washington that same day, the first thing I did is run to see Assistant Secretary of State Adolph Burley. It was from a conference with him that Weiss came out when he announced the massacre, which I saw in the paper. And I just ran there. I called up and I said I must see him, to the secretary. I've met with him before as part of groups of the Committee for Jewish Army, the leadership of the Committee for Jewish Army. So I knew him, not well, but he would know my name. He'd seen me a couple of times before. And I called the secretary and I said, did you see this thing in the paper? And she says, yes. I said, is it true? And she says, unfortunately. She says, what she knew. And I said, I must see him about this. And I just told her I'm coming and I'll wait until he's free, because he wasn't in the office, he was in the White House. And then he saw me. And he confirmed this to me. As a matter of fact, he even said that they had been urging Weiss to announce it a few weeks earlier. And I said, what are you going to do about it? Which I think, Larry, is a normal human reaction. I mean, when you hear of a thing like this, what are you going to do? And he says, what can we do? I say, surely there's something you can do. I said, I don't know what I can do. I'm telling you, Mr. Secretary, I'm going to do something. I mean, I'm going to do everything I can. I mean, from now on, that's all I'm going to do, is try and save the Jews. And then, this and that, and I felt, I mean, if I want to do something to save the Jews, I should make an enemy of an Assistant Secretary of State. So I apologized, and I thanked him for his kindness and so forth, and I left. And I went straight to the first phone I could reach and called Marilyn in New York, who was my right-hand man in those days, and called the meeting that night of all the active people in the Committee for Jewish Army. And I made a speech there, which was published someplace in the Answer magazine, in which I said that from now on we get up in the morning, we work all day and go to bed at night, only with one subject, and this is how to save the Jews. Now, if this would have been the attitude by 10% of the Jewish leadership in this country, many more, for every percent of Jewish leaders who would have thought so X% of Jews would have been saved. But there weren't any. Harold Ickes, the Secretary of Interior of the United States, was honorary chairman of the Emergency Committee to Save the Jewish People of Europe, which we eventually established in Washington. But you wouldn't give us one important Jew who joined our committee. One didn't rebel against the establishment and said, these people have an emergency committee to save the Jewish people of Europe. We joined. Max Lerner, the so-called liberal intellectual, who was co-chairman of the emergency conference to save the Jewish people of Europe, and did an excellent job, because he's a very intelligent, bright man, and he was at the prime of his life then as an academic person, and he steered this conference very well together with the other chairman. 3 weeks later, under pressure of the Jews, he calls me up, and he did an article while the conference was going on. He was writing for PM. He did an article called How's About the Jews, FDR. And PM was a pro-FDR paper, and so was he. And urging Roosevelt to do something. And 3 weeks later, he calls me up, and he became co-chairman of the emergency committee, together with other prominent people. And he calls me up and says he's going to resign. And I said, why? And he says, I don't want to be involved in internal Jewish squabble. I say, Max, you were with us. I mean, you were on the foundation of this thing. What squabbles? Are we talking about Jewish squabbles? Are we talking about saving the Jews of Europe? And he says, well, I've been pressured and this and that, and I'm resigning. And then I said to him, how's about the Jews, Max Lerner? And he started screaming at me and saying, I won't permit anybody, not even you, as much as I admire you, he says, to lecture to me. I said, I still ask you, how's about the Jews, Max Lerner? And that was, and he resigned. Now, the Jews could have been saved because it was possible to convince the Allies, especially the American government, that they should accept it as a principle. They should establish a special commission to save the Jews, not the War Refugee Board, because Hitler wasn't massacring refugees, he was massacring Jews. And they should have done it a year earlier. But the War Refugee Board was established late December 43, it was in 44 actually. Organized a demonstration of 500 rabbis. We finally managed to get one courageous Orthodox Jewish rabbi, the head of Agudas Israel, the non-Zionist outfit. Because all the rabbis boycotted us when we tried to organize it. And we had a tremendously impressive march to Washington. And we got Vice President Wallace to interrupt the session of the Senate, which he presided on deliberately that day, and ask all the senators to come to the steps of Capitol Hill to receive these rabbis who arrived by special train and marched on the Capitol. And we then marched from, after Wallace made a speech and the rabbis gave him a petition, there were tremendous papers in all the press and everywhere, all these rabbis crying. And we marched on the White House, and we tried for weeks before this demonstration to have Roosevelt receive the delegation just like Wallace received them. And it was the Jewish advisors, as published in a memoir of Roosevelt's secretary McIntyre, who was actually the man who received us, who says that one of the Jewish advisors said, President's Jewish friend said, these are not the kind of Jews you should associate with. And they spirited him out of the White House. Officially they told us he's out of town. What they did is that a couple of hours earlier they took him to a base to dedicate a bomber that was flying to Tito. This is what petrified, frightened Jews can do to themselves and to the brothers.
I think that one of the things that kept them from calling it a Jewish rescue war, that kept the rescue of the Jews from being a war aim, was the fear of a Jewish war, the Hitler's propaganda.
What do you mean they will say it's a Jewish war? Who will say it's a Jewish war? Hitler. Hitler was screaming his propaganda it's a Jewish war. So what? So the Allies didn't go to war for it. He was screaming it's a Jewish war because they went to war. The people who were afraid of the Jewish war were the Jews. Then and today, because they still accept it as an excuse.
What about the feeling that you couldn't ask an American boy from the Midwest to fight to save the Jews of Europe?
Well, what was he fighting for? What was he fighting for, that the American boy from the Midwest? What do you mean? Who says he should fight to save the Jews of Europe? Or did he fight to save the Scotch farmers in Scotland is better? Why, is the Jew less of a human being than a Scotch farmer? Didn't he go over? Was America threatened directly? And if America was threatened, wasn't saving the Jews part of saving America? I mean, wasn't he in the war? Wasn't it one war? Or was Hitler's war against the Jews something outside, or the Jews are outside of the pale of humanity? And this is precisely the core of the issue, Larry. That if you want to know what was the difference, is that we reacted on an assumption that the Jew is an equal human being. And I'm asking you again the question, why did the Allies threaten the Germans to use poison gas against them if they use it against Greek farmers, or Polish officers, or Norwegian seamen, and not against Jews? Why was it so outrageous to say that you should use poison gas if you kill Jews? I say it was a crime that they didn't do it. Because this was encouragement. And we said so. We had a phrase, we said, to the criminal Nazi mind, this is encouragement. And this was encouragement. To summarize, your question whether the Jews could have been saved, obviously not. Jews could have been saved. The proof is very simple. As the whole horror was over, hundreds of thousands of Jews survived. If we, the Jews, would have done our job better, if even we on the committee did our job better, I mean, we tried our utmost, but obviously we could have done more. If the Jewish leadership would have acted, if the Jews would have acted, the number of the survivors could have been doubled, tripled, fourfold. I don't want to make conjecture, but I think it's important to know that the number of people who survived was up to us, and if it was so small, it was the inadequacy of our activities. And if I were a Jewish leader, dead, I'd probably turning in grave, and if I was alive, I would have a very guilty conscience.